we're joined by Curtin University's Dr. Anne Aly, who was born in Egypt and grew up in Australia. She's an expert on Muslim identity and terrorism studies. Dr. Anne Aly, thanks very much for joining us. Why do some members of the Muslim faith react with violent protests when offended?
Good morning, Andrew. Well, I think the reason for that is that in some Muslim countries, violence is what they know. It's how they know to express their opinion. It's how they know to express protest. And I think that those Muslim countries have a responsibility, those governments have a responsibility to give their people other forms of protest, to give them the tools of protest that don't involve violence.
How did an obscure film, which, as we can tell, is only available on the internet, how did it gather such prominent attention in the Middle East and beyond?
That's a really good question, Andrew, and I think one that's going to be questioned for quite some time. I mean, if we look at what's happened with the film, we've got a whole lot of conflicting information about it, a whole lot of contradictory reports about its origins and where it came from. I've watched the film. It's very obvious that it's been dubbed. It's a very, very low budget, very, very obscure film. And so how it actually reached these populations is a question that I think we need to answer. I think there's a lot of mischief making being involved here. I think that it's highly unlikely that the number of crowds who are out there protesting have actually viewed the film or know anything about the trailer itself. So I think there's a whole lot of questions looming over this whole issue.
So, I mean, the protests were obviously prompted by these film clips, but is the real issue about mistrust of the US media, that the film has been labelled as US propaganda, and also of US foreign policy, particularly given the timing around September the 11th?
I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Andrew. The film itself is just a catalyst for the protests, but the protests are symptomatic of a deep-seated and long-standing suspicion and dislike of US foreign policy, a suspicion of the US media, a strong belief that the US is out to undermine Islam and part of a kind of global conspiracy against Islam. So these protests that we're seeing and the violence that's being perpetrated is simply a symptom of this long-standing and deep-seated suspicion and dislike of the US, its policies and what it stands for.
Does this also highlight what has happened during and since the Arab Spring Revolution? It was often sort of heralded as a new era of Arab acceptance of US policy. Is that the case?
Absolutely. I think, just even the terminology of the Arab Spring painted it and constructed it as a new era of hope, that, the Arab people were shunning dictatorship and moving towards the acceptance of Western democracy and craving Western democracy. And I think that was a misinterpretation of the Arab Spring. The revolutions were as much about getting rid of the dictators as they were about getting rid of a government that was perceived to be US friendly and perceived to be a puppet of the US. So I think there was a lot of misinterpretation about the Spring and possibly even false hope that the Arab Spring would bring about this new era of cooperation on democracy and Western democracy being introduced into the Arab world. Arabs want democracy, but they don't want Western democracy.
What are we likely to see from the leaders of these Arab countries, particularly Egypt, Mohammed Morsi? He obviously wants to appease the protesters, calm things down there, but at the same time, I guess there's a danger that he may offend the United States. How carefully does he have to tread?
I think he has to tread extremely carefully, and I think we kind of see it already, that they are saying, we don't condone the violence, but we also don't condone the film. Well, if you watched the film itself, or you watched the trailer for the film, first of all, we don't know that there is actually a film. There is a 9-minute or 15-minute trailer that's very, very badly made, that is obviously dubbed, and that's actually it's quite difficult to be offended by it because it's quite difficult to take it seriously. So I think he has to tread a very, very careful line, because I think if he doesn't come out and condemn the makers of the film and demand an apology from the US for the film, then he's likely to suffer backlash from the Muslim hardliners in Egypt. But at the same time, he needs to send a clear message that violence is not an appropriate response to things like this.